colleagues to see the forest through the trees and that the perfect is not the enemy of the good. Just as the trees my parents' generation planted created the canopy we enjoy today, trees planted today can and will create the canopy we need for my children.
Well, that is an embattled council member Dan Strauss finally reaching the finish line on a measure he sponsored to protect trees in Seattle. What impact will that legislation truly have? And who on the Seattle City Council is not supporting it? Plus, a new report on Seattle Police Department staffing showing some changes when it comes to officers staying or leaving. And also, what's next for the King County Regional Homelessness Authority? And are Amazon workers about to walk off the job? Well, we've got some big questions and hopefully a couple answers this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own. And I'm joined once again by my co-host, David Croman, reporter for the Seattle Times. David, you're out on the streets today. You're covering the beat, my man. What's it like being out of the house and chasing after things from street level?
Yeah, well, it's not entirely by choice. This is what it takes to get car maintenance while having a small child and a job. Is sometimes you work from Wendy's bench.
I love it. I love it. Even his bench play is solid. I love it, David. Thank you, as always, for making this happen with me. And also, thank you to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to our show patrons. The Seattle News, Views, and Brews sticker campaign is up and rolling, and we definitely need your help. I wanted to say thanks to Britt for her recent pledge and interacting with the show. The rest of you listeners, why can't you be more like your sister Britt? Come on, join the show as a patron. You get your very own decal for just $5 a month. We feature action photos of your sticker on the show, too. And patrons, if you have some photos out there, send a few in, why don't you? Email Seattle News, Views, and Brews at gmail.com. Thanks finally to Converge Media. We partner with Converge to air the video version of this podcast. Check it out on Converge's YouTube channel, Wednesday nights at 7. Let's get moving with right here, right now. Well, at long last, the city of Seattle has passed a tree ordinance, the final vote part of a 3-hour council meeting on Tuesday. And David, we have talked about this before, but I was really struck in this meeting that what started as a partnership between Councilmember Strauss and Councilmember Peterson on this measure a few years ago ended up with a no vote from Peterson after he unsuccessfully tried to delay the implementation of this legislation. He was the only no vote. The ordinance passed 6-1. Councilmember Sawant not present. Council President Juarez not present for that vote. I guess I wanted to ask, did the council need more time on this? I mean, it's been years in the making, but Councilmember Herbold also supported this idea for a delay, but the amendment really didn't have the votes to proceed. So here we are. Did the council need more time, David? What do you think?
I mean, I think for people who are frustrated with the final result of a piece of legislation, saying that it needs more time is often what they say. And, clearly Councilmember Peterson and to a certain extent Councilmember Herbold are frustrated with the end result here. They wanted to see kind of, I would say, perhaps more stringent tree protections. But, the reality is if you're working on something for as long as the city council has worked on this, at a certain point, you've kind of gone down every avenue you can. And clearly most of the council, almost all of them, except for Alex Peterson, felt satisfied enough with this to finally kind of put it to rest.
Yeah. And I guess I should point out what the bill does here, folks. Generally, it protects a lot more trees, somewhere between 88,000 and 175,000 trees, way up from the 17,000 plus protected under the current code. There are more protections for trees 24 inches wide, and trees 12 inches wide have to be replaced by one or more new trees, or you can pay into a fund for tree restoration. There's also a limitation on how many trees you can cut on your own property. That's been reduced to now 2 under a foot wide every 3 years. But David, in looking at this, the piece I'm most interested in is this. Is this measure going to have the impact the city wants, more tree canopy, specifically in the areas of the city that need it the most, these low-income neighborhoods? How does the city really guide this policy going forward? Because I don't think they're really done with this policy, even after the vote.
No, I mean, that's always a question with every piece of legislation is you can be perfectly happy with the end result of the language, but if you don't have an enforcement mechanism or oversight mechanism, it's hard to know what effect it'll really have. I don't know how many tree cops are out there on the road making sure that this is followed. Yeah, I mean, it's thorny, right? Because on the one hand, the question of kind of heat deserts or
Yes.
areas of the city that are particularly vulnerable to high temperatures. Of course, there's a big equity aspect there. There are fewer trees in South Seattle, more concrete. I think a lot of that has to do with the road design, which is those are also the areas with big arterials, infrastructure that tends to have a lot more concrete also. But on the other hand, I think this through the whole thing, this tree canopy debate has also been a bit of a proxy for some of the housing density debates too, which is there is a good amount of correlation between people who are concerned about additional density in the city and people who care a lot about the tree canopy ordinance. So, that's always been the balancing act here. And I think that's why at the end of the day, there was always going to be frustration in people who think that they should be taking more time, because it is in some ways a stand-in for several larger debates happening in the city.
Yeah, and that also struck me with this, David. Nobody was really happy with this. People who wanted to preserve trees. I feel like some of the developers got a little bit more what they wanted out of this, but still, we're talking about a situation where they're going to have to pay into a fund here when they start cutting down more trees. So over the next 60 days, folks, this is definitely something that we're going to be keeping an eye on. I know you will too. And I really am interested to see where the council guides this, because that equity issue, where these trees are placed, how they're placed, that's the devil in the details with this, and a lot of details with this one for sure. I want to move on to another piece here with you here, David. A report from the Seattle Police Department this week in the Public Safety Committee on officer retention, response time, and recruiting that has a number of interesting nuggets here. A quick breakdown here, folks. Separations, meaning officers leaving the department, those are slowing down. That downward trend of losing officers appears to have bottomed out, maybe even some slight gains in the past quarter. Overtime spending, though, is way up, and response times, depends on where you live. They are decreased in the South and West precincts, but they are up in the North precinct for all types of 911 calls. And David, I want to talk about some of this before we jump into the recruiting piece. Concerns you have with these numbers, positive trends jumping out at you. What are you seeing?
I think it's probably comes as a relief that there are signs that the numbers have bottomed out, because the recruitment has been swinging pretty hard lately, and I think to a certain extent they have succeeded at it. The issue has been that they it has not been enough to replace the number of people leaving, just because that number has been so high. I think probably what we're seeing is some of that churn settling down a little bit, that fewer police are because if you were a Seattle police officer who was eager to get out of Seattle and frustrated with the direction Seattle was going, you were probably going to leave in the last few years.
Right.
If you're still a police officer with the Seattle Police Department, then you have made peace with that and are okay with that. I would think, because anyone who has been paying attention, I think that the temperature has come down quite a bit since 2020 and 2021, both in City Hall, but also we don't see the protests or the activism that we did before.
Right.
I'd be curious to know. I think the thing about this that I think has always fallen a little short in some of the debates is, Seattle gets a lot of blame, but every police department has really struggled with this right now. The state patrol is desperate for patrol officers and can't find them, and that's a statewide office, so you can't really put that on any sort of defund the police rhetoric or anything like that, because and I think that's true for a lot of departments. And so I'd be curious to know, is this, which I haven't looked into, is this Seattle specific, or are other departments also kind of seeing a flattening? I don't know. I mean, I would suspect that Seattle is sort of vulnerable or subject to the same national trends that everybody is.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up, because this gets me to the whole recruiting piece. And Seattle has these recruitment bonuses that were approved by the city council last year. Those are definitely getting put to use, and we are seeing these numbers, as you say, start to bottom out, maybe start to rise a little bit when it comes to officers coming on the job. But it was interesting to me, David, to look in this report, and there was a quote from the SPD on this one I'll lay on you. The executive, that means the mayor, has been slow to spend the funding that has been appropriated for recruitment and retention. I think this one is super interesting for a few reasons. I know the council's keeping an eye on it because if dollars go unspent, they're going to work on grabbing those up and spending them elsewhere. It's a tighter budget picture they are dealing with right now. But David, it kind of sounds like the SPD would like a little more guidance from the mayor on this one if they're going to increase their numbers. Talk to me about this recruitment issue and what sort of recruitment campaign, I guess, can they put out there to attract officers?
Yeah, that I thought was interesting also. I have been sort of watching closely and less closely City Hall for a long time, and that every mayor since I can remember has talked about launching recruiting campaigns, and
yep,
what those look like have varied. Accepting more, giving people more incentives. Of course, there's signing bonus, but giving people more incentives who can speak multiple languages or who have done Peace Corps. There's military incentives and things like that, and then basically we have seen around town billboards or job fairs, job conventions, and things like that. I haven't seen a great look at how effective those have been, or if they've been effective. Again, it feels like the kind of national forces are much more powerful than any sort of job fair can do. Yeah. That said, like you said, anytime there's money available that's not being spent, it tends to not sit there for very long, because especially right now, the budgets are not what they used to be in the city of Seattle, and the city council has a lot of priorities. So yeah, as far as what is or isn't happening as far as recruiting, I don't know. I'd be curious to follow along a little bit with a recruiter and see what it is they're actually doing.
Right. I've done that before, David. It's a really fascinating process because I think it's changed. I mean, going to the job fair is almost the old-timey way of doing it, right? I mean, there's a big social media presence piece of this. They're trying to reach out to younger people. They're trying to make sure they cast a wider net. And I'm interested, too, to see, first, getting that money spent is the piece, but just how it gets done. And I know it's an issue that the SPD wants to focus on. So, yeah, I know with Chief Diaz and his Before the Badge program and all the other things he's trying to do to improve the department from that very low level, the recruits that are coming in, there's going to be something that the council, the mayor, everybody's going to be focusing on in the months and weeks to come. So, yeah, please.
And in the past, and I don't know if this is still an issue, the city has complained a lot about a bottleneck at the academy, that they can only fit so many people into an academy class. The city actually has talked for years about starting their own academy. Yeah. Has never happened. It would, I think, cost a lot of money and effort to stand up. But there have been some pushes to fund more classes at the academy. So I don't know how much of it is that too, which is maybe they're doing great at recruiting, but they just can't get people through the academy. I don't know. It's another thing to look at.
True. Yeah, the state legislature actually expanded the amount of academies that we're going to see around the state. So hopefully that'll ease up the bottleneck in the coming years. But those things take time to stand up. So definitely good points there, David. Thank you for bringing that up. All right, up next, the fallout from Mark Dones resigning as CEO of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. What's next for this agency? What's next for the homelessness crisis in our region? We're going to talk about it on Now Hear This. Well, just after we released last week's podcast, a real news bombshell hit. King County Regional Homelessness Authority CEO Mark Dones abruptly resigned, leaving a lot of questions behind. Now, I talked with Mark on Seattle Channel 6 months ago about the year ahead, which would be this year, 2023. And Mark told me during that show back in November of last year, we'd be seeing a big reduction in homelessness in downtown Seattle this year. And he also had this to say as well.
And the other thing that I think we'll talk about next year is how, again, we have restructured the system so that it's not that Frankenstein, but is coherent and makes sense and is an engine that can really be used to end homelessness in our region.
Well, that whole idea that the RHA would be better organized this year simply has not yet come to pass. A number of agencies told the Seattle Times and other outlets that the authority fell behind on contracts, making it hard to pay employees. And then there was that multi-billion-dollar budget proposal back in January for a plan to end homelessness. That really didn't sit well either. David, just a quick post-mortem here. Was Mark Dones a bad fit for this agency in this region, or how did you read this?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think he was very frank. In the times I've talked to him, he's been very clear about what he thinks is necessary, and we saw that with that proposal to raise $12 billion.
Yep.
He also thinks very, at least this is my perception of him. I didn't cover him very closely, but I have talked to him a few times. My perception was he thinks very systemically. He talks a lot about the big, larger forces that are contributing to homelessness, and all of which I think are true. I think that the issue was he's coming into an environment in which things have moved very slowly, and so I think perhaps statements about what needs to be done in the large sense didn't quite gain much traction over, especially when they were perceived to be coming at the expense of things like getting contractors their money.
Yeah, the here and now, exactly.
Yeah, and so that I think was always an inherent tension, and especially in a system that is so immolating as some of the homelessness responses. There's just a lot of different politics all within the same space, and it's Mark Jones himself, I think, in kind of the introductory profile that Scott Greenstone did in the Seattle Times, called it herding cats. And so it was always going to be a very hard job for anybody to do. Even if the idea of having one central authority is appealing, bringing Seattle on the same page as Federal Way and all the suburban cities and things like that, and getting all of these various homelessness response systems into the same system, that was always going to be impossible in some ways, and really difficult. And it's why that there was some real opposition to starting this up even in the first place. In some ways, those chickens are coming home to roost a little bit. I'd be curious to see who the next person is, if it's somebody who maybe is a little less idealistic, and I don't mean that in a negative way, idealistic, but somebody who maybe talks a little bit less about sort of the Reagan era disinvestment of public housing and more about who's the accountant who's going to write the checks, things like that.
And what are we going to do tomorrow, rather than these larger scale plans? And you're kind of leading in the direction I want to go, David, with where do we go from here? And I will point this out. The RHA has made some accomplishments in terms of using federal housing vouchers to get people in, national attention surrounding that. There have been some other efforts going on between neighboring cities like Bellevue, like Kent, that have received some recognition from the RHA. So it's not like no work has been going on here. And I should point out, this was a little bit under the radar last week, but the RHA Implementation Board approved a new 5-year plan that operates within the budget they have. $253 million in 2023, and then there's a proposed budget of fewer dollars, as it turns out, $250 million for the next year. The governing committee will vote on this June 1st, so something to keep an eye on over the next week here. And I guess that's my big question here, David. Does the KCRHA live on? I know your colleague Denny Westneat brought up maybe it's time to dismantle it. What needs to happen? Do we need this structure going forward?
Well, I mean, I remember, I think it was 2016, there was this big report, that the Barb Poppy report that everyone so anticipated so much. And it, what the major conclusion of that report was, there needs to be more a more centralized structure, because you've got Seattle, you've got King County, you've got all the individual cities, you've got the United Way, so, and then there's private philanthropy. So there's so many different avenues, and each homeless provider is filling out different grant applications for each. And so I don't know that you'd find a lot of appetite for doubling down on that system. That said, centralizing and consolidation is just a really difficult thing to do in government. I will say that there's also probably an impatient aspect to this too, which is that housing and building housing and getting people into homes is a really slow process, so it's possible too that just like Mark Jones is a victim of people wanting to see things happen on a timeline that is just not all that realistic. If you're it takes many years to permit and fund some of this affordable housing. So, I don't think it was so much work and so much money went into setting this thing up. I'd be surprised if anyone was quite ready to pull the plug. But the fact that the topic has come up already just a few years is notable, and probably something that's, if it's on the mind of Danny Westgate, it's probably on the mind of some people in city halls around King County.
Yeah, there was definitely some pushback on that idea by the Metro Chamber of Commerce, some of the business heads who really put a lot of effort and their own dollars into the RHA as well. So I know there's some tension there between those different groups and the cities involved too. But we're going to see what happens with that vote coming up from the governing committee on June 1st for the RHA. That'll really provide some guidance as to where that agency is going in the years ahead. I wanted to talk about another interesting story over this past week, hearing about a possible walkout of Amazon workers, David, on May 1st. And we've talked about this on the podcast. Amazon employees ordered back on the job for at least 3 days a week. Back on May 1st, that started happening. Now, as we've seen reported in the Washington Post, the Seattle Times, and other outlets too, there is a walkout plan due to frustrations over that return to the office order, the layoffs, and what some workers call a lack of action from Amazon to deal with climate change. I'm just going to be really interested, David, to see who's involved in this walkout and what sort of organization will be involved with this besides the Employees for Climate Justice, because they've been in this mix for a little while. I've just read a lot about anonymous voices in these news accounts. What do you make of this story? Who's going to get involved in this walkout, David? What do you think?
It's interesting. I mean, I make a few things of the story. I mean, one, there's always this kind of inherent tension between Amazon and its workers. I think because Amazon is in a very progressive city, and several, they set up shops in cosmopolitan cities, and so their workforce, which is highly educated and is going to lean more liberal, and I think there's going to always be a little bit of tension there between some of its left-leaning tech workforce and some of the goals of the larger company. I also think if I'm a union organizer, I'm probably salivating a little bit at this. It's not organizing the warehouses, which is kind of its own animal, but seeing collective action from Amazon workers, I'm sure, is something that Amazon is sort of the white whale of union organizing, and so any sort of chance to find activist-minded employees in one place is probably red meat for union organizers. But also, I think more broadly, a couple of years ago, all of the leverage was in the hands of the workers themselves because the demand was so high. All these companies were hiring so much, and that's why I think it took so long for these return to work policies to ever take place, because people could feel so confident that they could quit a job and go somewhere else that the companies were terrified to impose any of these rules. That leverage is largely gone now because all the companies have been doing layoffs. And so, I think the return to work policy is a show of confidence that Amazon is going to be able to do this without losing very many workers. And I think there's probably some acknowledgement from the workers that that's true. But so these walkouts are in some ways, it's like a union action. It's a way to try and regain a little bit of leverage that the workers have lost. I don't know that it's going to come anywhere close to making up for that loss of leverage, but that is the kind of goal of collective action, is to gain that leverage and to be a show of force. How many people show up and actually do it, I think, will be key as to whether it's something that Amazon actually needs to pay attention to and be worried about.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that point about who shows up, because there was a response to this return to office mandate earlier this year. More than 20,000 workers signed on a petition urging Amazon to reconsider that. But in looking at all the different pieces that you were bringing up there, David, I'm not sure if we're going to see 20,000 people down there by the globes. That would be really something. But definitely something to keep an eye on around the globes. May 31st, we'll see what that walkout looks like. All right, well, coming up, need to move on here. What is on your summer reading list? Are you looking for a true crime story, a romance, a thriller? Well, David's been working on a story about reading odometers. Yeah, some disagreement about this issue at the state level. We're going to talk about it on Transportation Talk. David, you recently reported on a veto from Governor Jay Inslee that would have required the state to ask drivers to volunteer their odometer readings. This is part of this long-standing effort to figure out a tax on miles traveled rather than the current gas tax that we have. Why is this veto important? Where is this issue headed?
Yeah, we wrote about this because, it's the veto itself, I think, in some ways is not huge because the policy was not, frankly, that big of a deal or that invasive because this is all voluntary. Department of Licensing Workers were going to ask you if you wanted to volunteer your odometer readings. Not a huge deal, but symbolically, it struck me as interesting because what the governor is, because as you mentioned, this was the sort of first step in many towards basically, replacing the gas tax. So what the governor said in vetoing this is he sort of read this bill, which is, again, not a big step, but he read it as assuming that the state is sort of marching in the direction of actually implementing a road usage charge. And he didn't like that. And so I think this is kind of a interesting early signal from the governor's office about he's clearly not sold on a road usage charge. He doesn't want the legislature or the state to kind of start marching down this path towards inevitability of implementing it. And I think that suggests that maybe, I think at the beginning of the session, there was some sense that this could be the beginning of actually implementing this road usage charge. And this veto basically wipes that clean, that we're sort of back to square one on that being the case. So, it struck me as interesting because I wouldn't be surprised now if the legislature has sort of gotten the message a little bit from the governor's office and next session starts talking about other things that might make sense instead of a road usage charge to replace a gas tax eventually.
Yeah, because I know no Republicans voted for this measure, so it was a big Democratic push, and I guess I think too we're going to have a new governor coming up here in a couple of months. So I'm just trying to figure out if there's any appetite for this in the future, I suppose, because that overarching problem here, David, is that as we have more cars that run on electricity, we can't rely on the gas tax as much anymore, right?
Yeah, that's the theory. It hasn't revenue from the gas tax is still going up. It's not going up as quickly as they had forecast, and I think that's because population in the state is still going up, but the cars are getting more efficient. So the state is. I think part of what's driving this is the state is not in crisis mode yet on this. And I think there's a lot of fear about how difficult. The gas tax is the easiest tax in the world to implement because it's just you bake it right into the price. It's basically zero administrative cost. There's no way to cheat it unless you just are stealing gas.
Right.
And so, whereas the road usage charge is very complicated, it takes a lot of administrative work to implement. And I think that's spooking some people. And so the combination of there's maybe not as much urgency to replace the gas tax as some had previously predicted, combined with now you've got a governor who's clearly a little skeptical of it. I think the veto is interesting in that it is perhaps a significant, not the final nail, but a nail in the coffin of the road usage charge.
Interesting. Well, we'll see what happens next with that one. That's a super interesting topic that's going to be going years into the future here, but we do need to wrap up. David, call on your gardening skills. I just wanted to lay this out here. I caved in last weekend, planted tomatoes, only to see a pretty big dump of rain and colder temperatures right after that in West Seattle, at least on Sunday and Monday. Did I blow it? Talk me through it. Where am I at here?
No, I don't think you blew it because it was so hot there for a while. In some ways, what matters the most is the temperature of your soil. The tomato might look a little unhappy for a couple days or maybe even a couple weeks, but it'll bounce back. Tomatoes are more resilient than people give them credit for.
I like it. I'm feeling resilient already, David. Thank you so much. Thanks also to everybody listening out there to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is on Apple, Spotify, wherever you might like to listen. Please find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Show your support. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media as well. We'll see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2023.